The world went silent. One moment, the M60 machine gun was bucking against my shoulder, a roaring beast spitting fire into the chaos. The next, nothing. Just a dead heavy weight in my hands. The gun was smoking, the metal radiating a heat I could feel through my fatigues. But the life-giving, life-taking rhythm was gone. Out in front of me, in the tall grass and scrub, the enemy was still moving. I could see the flickers of motion, the subtle shifts that meant men were crawling closer. Red hydraulic fluid, thick and slick as blood, sprayed from the ceiling, misting the air and coating everything in a gruesome sheen. I saw the wounded and dead Marines we had just taken on board, their bloody uniforms seeming to melt into the crimson chaos of the cabin. The helicopter's blades, riddled with what must have been 50 rounds in a matter of seconds, weren't chopping the air anymore. They were whistling. It was a high, thin, terrifying sound. The sound of metal pushed past its breaking point. A scream that promised a catastrophic failure at any second. My most primal fear was that we would throw a blade. If that happened, we would just tumble, a 16-ton brick falling from the sky. I prayed, not with words, but with a desperate, silent plea that flooded my entire being. Just hold together. Just a little longer. Behind me, I heard a cry that was different from the mechanical groans of our dying bird. I glanced back. A young black kid, a gunner like I had been, was slumped against the bulkhead. His face was a mask of shock and pain. A dark stain was spreading rapidly across his back, a fatal wound. In that instant, as we fell from the sky, as the whistling of the blades reached a fever pitch, as the world was a blur of green earth and red fluid, one crystal clear thought cut through the panic in my mind. I have 20 days left in this country. I just hope I can make it home. That storm of violence was near the end of my tour. The beginning, almost a year earlier, had been a world away, an arrival steeped not in chaos, but in a strange and foreign stillness. Stepping off the C-141 into the thick, humid air of Pleiku was like walking into another dimension. The very air smelled different. It wasn't an unpleasant smell, just un-American. It was a mix of damp earth, exotic vegetation, and something else. Something I couldn't place but knew was the scent of a foreign land. My first sight wasn't of battle, but its aftermath. To one side of the tarmac, a group of about 30 or 40 prisoners of war sat bound on the ground. They were local combatants, dressed in the simple black pajama-like outfits I'd seen in newspapers. A long stick was secured behind their backs, pinning their arms, and they were all tied together, neck to neck, with a single rope. They were the enemy. Seeing them in person, so small and defeated, was a stark and silent introduction to the reality of the war. I was a long, long way from San Antonio. From Pleiku, a C-130 Hercules flew us to Ankei, to the sprawling base camp of the 1st Cavalry Division at Camp Radcliffe. For me, this was the fulfillment of a dream. Back in high school, I had been a history buff, poring over newspaper articles about the war. I saw the iconic images of the Hueys, the sleek workhorses of the air, and the soldiers with the big, bold 1st Cavalry patch on their shoulders. I told myself then, with the certainty of youth, that if I went to Vietnam, that was the unit I wanted to be in. Now, stepping onto the soil of their headquarters, it was real. I wasn't going to be a pilot. My left eye wasn't quite 20/20, but I was going to be an air crewman. I was going to fly. I was a 1st Cav trooper. Camp Radcliffe was nothing like the orderly military bases back in the States. It was a raw, sprawling camp carved out of the boonies. There were no asphalt streets or permanent concrete buildings. It was a collection of wooden hooches, canvas tents with concrete floors, and scattered metal tables. Our bathrooms weren't flush toilets, but long wooden benches with holes cut in them, positioned over half-cut oil drums. It was the unfortunate duty of new arrivals and men on punishment detail to haul those canisters out and burn the human waste. It was a different world. At night, the camp ran on generators, but they often failed, plunging us into darkness relieved only by the flickering of candles and the beams of our flashlights. Initially, I was assigned to a ground crew, working as a mechanic on the Chinooks that came in from the flight line. I wasn't yet on flying status, but I was determined to prove myself. A typical day started before dawn. We'd get up, have breakfast in the mess hall, and head out to the flight line as the sky began to lighten around 6 in the morning. We worked on the helicopters that came in for their periodic inspections after 100 hours of flight time, performing the necessary maintenance and mechanical work. Sometimes a bird would come in all shot to pieces, and we'd have to patch it up, replacing damaged components and making it airworthy again. Being an 18-year-old and full of gung-ho energy, I couldn't just stay on the ground. When they called for volunteers to go out on patrol to do some real grunt work, my hand always went up. They handed me an M16, and it felt like a toy from Mattel compared to the heavy M14 I had trained with. It was all black plastic and lightweight metal, but after a week of training, learning to break it down and reassemble it, learning its feel, it became an extension of my arm. During my first 3 months as a ground mechanic, I went out on about 4 or 5 patrols. These patrols were called Vanguard units. They were small, composed of maybe 12 or 14 of us, cobbled together from various companies within the aviation battalions. I was from the 228th, the Chinook Battalion, but we were out there supporting the infantry units of the 1st Cavalry, the 5th Cav or the 7th Cav. We would be inserted into the field, about a mile or two ahead of the main friendly force, acting as a tripwire. Our job was to be the first line of detection. If the North Vietnamese regulars or the local partisans decided to organize and attack the main body, they would have to come through us first. We were the early warning system. Out there in the field, the world shrank to the humid jungle, the sweat that constantly drenched my uniform, and the gnawing tension. At night, we'd pull leeches off our ankles and try to brush away the swarms of insects. It was a raw and primal existence. It was also where I first truly saw the wildness of Vietnam. Once, a black panther, sleek and powerful, materialized out of the bush not 12 feet from me. It crawled into the clearing, its green eyes locking onto mine. For a long, breathless moment, we just stared at each other, 2 predators in the same jungle. Then, as silently as it appeared, it turned and melted back into the shadows. Another time, just a couple of feet from where I was sitting, a bamboo viper slithered by, its lethal beauty a stark reminder of the countless ways this land could kill you. But the most profound encounters were not with the wildlife. It was on these patrols that I first saw the dead. Back home, the only dead I had ever seen were grandparents or uncles, laid out peacefully in coffins, looking as if they were merely asleep. This was nothing like that. Here the dead, ours and theirs, were sprawled on the ground, in the sand, tangled in the bushes. It was a shocking, visceral sight, worse than any roadkill on a highway. The high-velocity weapons we used didn't leave neat little holes. They tore the human body apart. I fought back the urge to vomit, forcing myself to look away, to focus on a tree or a cloud, anything other than the broken forms on the ground. Sometimes we would pass through villages that had seen recent fighting. The air would be filled with the high, keening wail of women grieving for their lost loved ones. And there was the stench. A body left in the hot sun for even a short while would bloat and turn black, emitting a smell that was sickly sweet and unforgettable. This was all new to me, a brutal education in the finality of war. I hoped I would never have to see it again, but I knew with a grim certainty that this was what I had signed up for. All the while I was on the ground, I kept bugging the first sergeant. I'd ask him every chance I got when I was going to be transferred to the flight platoon. I hadn't come to Vietnam to be a ground pounder. I wanted to be a flying crewman. Finally, after my patrols in June, I even turned 19 out there in the field. The word came down. I was going to be a gunner. The flight physical was a formality. I went to the medic's tent, filled out a standard form, checking no to all the questions about headaches or nausea. The doctor glanced at it, looked up at me, and asked if I wore glasses. I told him no. He just stamped the form, flight approved, without even taking my blood pressure or checking my eyes. I was ecstatic. As a gunner, I was assigned 2 M60 machine guns. These weren't the standard infantry models with a stock. They were fitted with an aerial-type gun handle for use in the helicopter. My life fell into a new rhythm. I was no longer tied to one aircraft. Like the pilots, I rotated between different Chinooks, which meant I racked up flying hours quickly. Every morning, long before dawn, around 4 o'clock, I'd go to my assigned aircraft for the day. The crew chief and flight engineer would have already pre-flighted it. My job was to mount my M60s, one on each side of the aircraft, and load them up with boxes of ammunition, usually 500 to 700 rounds per gun. I'd also bring along an extra barrel and an asbestos glove, in case one of the barrels overheated during a firefight. Our helicopter pad, a scattered collection of clearings, we called the golf course. For an early morning combat assault, we would load up our troopers on one part of the golf course, lift off into the darkness, and begin circling the base. One by one, other Chinooks and the smaller Hueys, both the slicks carrying troops and the heavily armed gunships, would join us. We'd form up into a massive, buzzing swarm of aircraft, a mad swarm of bees, our navigation lights blending with the stars in the night sky. It was a scary, exhilarating sight. Once assembled, we would head out to our target. Many times we would hit villages along the coast of the South China Sea. As we approached, the formation would circle. Then the small OH-13 Sioux observation helicopters, the kind you'd see on the MASH TV show, would fly in low and drop flares. The moment those flares ignited, illuminating the village below, the ground would erupt with gunfire. Tracers would arc up into the sky, reaching for the little observation choppers. That was the signal for the Huey gunships. They would dive in, their machine guns and rockets tearing the village apart, setting the thatched roofs on fire. While this was happening, we Chinooks, along with the Huey slicks, would come in low and fast to land our troops, establishing a perimeter, cutting off any escape routes. We drop the troopers and immediately lift off, circling again, waiting. The local combatants, surprised and outgunned, would often try to retreat inland into the jungle. That's when we'd get the call to go back in. We'd swoop down, pick up a group of troopers, and leapfrog them, like a knight in a chess game, flying low and fast to a position ahead of the retreating enemy, cutting them off again. It was during these low-level flights that we took the most fire. The rounds hitting the thin metal skin of the aircraft sounded like someone was outside, banging on a garbage can with a hammer. The first time it happened, my training took over, but it was mixed with a surge of pure instinct. I didn't just want to spray bullets into the jungle. I wanted to see my target. I scanned the ground relentlessly, searching for a muzzle flash, for the sight of the enemy. I saw a man in black pajamas break from the cover of some bushes, running across an open area. I opened fire. I could see my rounds kicking up dust all around him, and then I saw the red blossoms appear on his black uniform as he fell. When the mission was over that day, a strange feeling washed over me. It was a mix of adrenaline, relief, and a deep, unsettling guilt. I had killed someone. As a Catholic, I had been taught that killing was a mortal sin. My knees felt shaky. One of the older sergeants must have seen the look on my face. He came over and put a hand on my shoulder. He didn't shout or lecture. He just asked a simple question that cut right through my confusion. He told me to picture my mother, my grandmother, all my aunts crying because I was the one who had been killed. Then he told me to consider that the man I shot also had a mother and a grandmother who would be crying, but I didn't know them. I didn't know what they looked like. It shouldn't faze me. It should only faze me if I was the one who had gotten killed. His logic was brutal, but it was the logic of survival. In that moment, I accepted a hard truth. If someone was going to die, it was better him than me. I wanted to go home in one piece. That acceptance was a turning point. It didn't make it easy, but it made it necessary. I remember one mission where we had flushed a group of partisans out of a village near a river bend. We had dropped troops on one side, and instead of fighting, the enemy tried to swim across the wide river to escape. From the air hovering over the water, they were completely exposed. Chinooks and Hueys just opened up on them. It was like shooting ducks in the water. I shot 2 men in a row that day. The feeling wasn't one of triumph, but of grim necessity. The more of them I killed today, the fewer there would be to shoot at me or my friends tomorrow. This attitude took root and grew quickly, watered by the loss of friends. You'd have breakfast with a guy, laughing and talking, and by supper time, you'd hear he'd been killed or so badly wounded he was being sent to Japan. You learned to accept it as part of the job. You learned that the best way to protect yourself and your friends was to destroy the enemy. The danger was constant. The enemy's weapons, likely .30 caliber rounds, could easily puncture the floor and sides of our aircraft. I had many close calls. One time after a particularly hot landing zone, I was looking around the cabin and saw a fresh bullet hole in the floor, not more than an inch or two from my left heel. I looked up and saw the corresponding exit hole in the ceiling, an inch. That was the margin between me being fine and me being gone. You started to get used to the aircraft taking hits, to hearing that hammer on a garbage can sound. Every time it happened, you just start scanning the ground again, looking for the source of the fire so you could return it. We were always flying low, always a big target. The Army lost over 6,000 helicopters in Vietnam, most of them Hueys. The Chinooks were tougher, but we still lost nearly 200 of them. I saw many downed Hueys during my tour, either sitting on their skids after an auto-rotation, or lying on their sides, or completely upside down. But I only ever saw one go down in real time. I was still a gunner. We were flying in formation when one of the pilots called out over the intercom that a slick ahead of us was going down. I stuck my head out and looked forward. A Huey, its cabin still full of troopers, was nosing over, almost straight down. We weren't flying that high, maybe just a couple 100 feet up. The trip to the ground was terrifyingly quick. One moment it was in the air, the next it hit the earth and erupted in a massive ball of fire. It wasn't like in the movies, where a B-17 trails smoke for miles as it falls. It was just over. A split second of flight, then a violent, fiery end. After 3 months and 300 combat assaults as a gunner, I was promoted to crew chief, an E4. My role changed. Instead of rotating between aircraft, I was assigned to one specific Chinook. I flew fewer missions, only about 100 combat assaults in this role, because my primary responsibility was the maintenance and readiness of my bird. I was now the gunner on the right-hand side. Every time we came down, whether for a meal or at the end of the day, the flight engineer and I would go over the aircraft with a fine-tooth comb. We'd check the hydraulic and oil levels, the drive shafting, the nuts and bolts, the safety wiring. The resilient mounts on the drive shafts were a constant problem. They'd often break, so we carried a footlocker full of replacements. A failure there could cause the whole helicopter to come apart in the air. It was as a crew chief that I had my most comical and, in a strange way, most Texan experience of the war. We were tasked with relocating some of the Montagnard people, the indigenous tribes of the Central Highlands, to more secure villages. On one of these missions, we were also transporting their livestock. This included a very stubborn cow. The cow did not want to get on the helicopter. The noise of the engines and the powerful downdraft from the big rotor blades terrified it. The Montagnards finally forced it inside, but then we had to strap it down. One of my crewmates yelled over the noise, "Hey Alvarez, you're from Texas. You handle it." So there I was, in the middle of a war zone, faced with a panicking cow. I grabbed its head, trying to twist it down like I'd seen in rodeos, trying to bulldog it to the floor. It was a lot harder than it looked. Finally, the other 2 crewmen jumped in, and together we wrestled the cow to the ground and secured it with cargo straps. When we landed and I unstrapped the cow, it looked me right in the eye and left a very large, very wet souvenir on the floor of my aircraft. As the gunner, it was my job to clean it out. A broom wasn't going to cut it. I had to use a shovel. For a moment, I wasn't a soldier. I was a ranch hand who had been promoted to cowboy in the middle of Vietnam. In November of 1967, our unit was sent to support the 4th Infantry Division in the Battle of Dak To in Kon Tum Province. The terrain there was different from the mountains of the Central Highlands. It was flatter, dustier, and infested with mosquitoes and huge rats. One night, a rat got into the aircraft and ate all the padding out of a crewman's helmet. Our mission was relentless. We flew for 2 or 3 days straight, came back for a half day of intense maintenance, and went right back out. We weren't flying from Nkei. We established our own temporary landing zones in the Kon Tum area, complete with fuel and lubricants for the aircraft. We moved infantry into position, often landing them right on top of the enemy. We also moved their artillery, the smaller 120mm howitzers, from one fire base to another, along with all their ammunition. This gave our grunts constant fire support, a lifeline in the thick of the fighting. I remember landing at an Air Force airfield in Kon Tum to refuel. It was dotted with C-130s and C-123s. We had just filled our tanks and were pulling away when the base started taking rocket fire. I looked back and saw one of the C-130s engulfed in a massive fireball. At that level, as a crew chief, I wasn't aware of the larger strategic picture of Operation MacArthur. My world was about keeping my helicopter flying, supporting the grunts, and staying alive. My impression was that we were doing our jobs well, that we were accomplishing our goals, but the larger puzzle of the war was something for generals to worry about. By the end of December, I was promoted again, this time to flight engineer, a specialist 5. I was a 19-year-old junior NCO. This meant I was finally exempt from KP and regular guard duty. My sole responsibility was the flight health of my assigned aircraft. I kept the logbook, and my signature was the final word on its airworthiness. The lives of the crew and any passengers we carried were in my hands. It was a heavy responsibility, but I was proud to have earned it. Being an NCO also meant I could go to the NCO club, but I didn't much care for it. It was full of older, career soldiers. I was just a kid. I preferred the regular enlisted service club, where I could get a drink, listen to music, and occasionally see a USO show. Christmas of 1967 brought a welcome surprise. My aircraft was down for maintenance, so a few of us air crewmen got to go to Phuket Air Force Base to see the Bob Hope show. It was a surreal experience. The Air Force Base was like a piece of America dropped into the jungle, with asphalt streets and buildings with air conditioners. We flew in on a Chinook and joined a formation of grunts. As we marched toward the distant stage, we were faced with a sea of thousands of Air Force personnel. But when they saw us coming, with our first cav patches on our shoulders, they parted like the Red Sea. We could hear them murmuring, "Horse soldiers, horse soldiers." We combat troopers were ushered right to the front, to the benches reserved for us. The Air Force guys were secondary. I got to see Bob Hope and Raquel Welch. I ran out of film, of course, and only got 2 snapshots, but it was a moment of pure, enjoyable escape. January 1968 started with a bang. The enemy began to get bolder, probing our defenses at An-Khe more frequently. One Monday morning, around 2 o'clock, they hit us hard with rockets and mortars, and then they penetrated the wire. The call went out for flight crewmen to grab their weapons and protect the aircraft on the golf course. They gave us Remington 10-gauge shotguns. The night was chaos. Tracers flew everywhere, yellow for us, green for them. You could hear the zing of bullets passing right by your head. It wasn't like the movies where you can just shoot at anything that moves. The enemy was mixed in with our own troops. I was terrified of shooting one of our own guys. You had to be absolutely sure of your target. The fighting lasted for 2.5 days. I was exhausted, hungry, and running on a single sandwich. Finally, the 1st Cav brought in the 123rd Airborne Brigade. They formed a long, straight line at one end of the camp and just swept through, clearing out every last partisan. Seeing them arrive was the greatest relief I had ever felt. Then came my first crash. We were flying in a place called Happy Valley, deep in the Central Highlands. We started taking hits and one round struck our combining box. That's a critical transmission that synchronizes the front and rear rotor blades, keeping them from hitting each other. The pilot came over the intercom, his voice tense but steady, telling me we had a hit in the combining box and we were going down now. You don't fly for a second longer than you have to with that kind of damage. As long as the blades were still turning in one piece, we had a chance. We came down hard but controlled, landing in the middle of nowhere. Luckily, the transmission fluid hadn't all leaked out, and the blades hadn't clashed. We were in one piece. As soon as we landed, a perimeter formed around us. It was composed of 2 American Green Berets, a master sergeant and a first lieutenant, and about 200 of their irregular local forces. They led us away from the chopper into the boonies. One of them pulled aside some bushes, revealing the entrance to a hidden tunnel. We followed them down into their command post. They were glad to see us. They told us we were the first round eyes they had seen in 6 months. We used their radio to call back to Camp Radcliffe for a replacement transmission. The next day, a Huey arrived with a maintenance crew and a new combining box. There, out in the open, with the irregulars keeping the enemy at bay, we used a makeshift crank to hoist the new transmission into place on top of the chopper. I was worried the whole time that a sniper might see us, but the irregulars did their job. We got the new part installed, and we flew our wounded bird out of there. Toward the end of January, the Tet Offensive erupted across the country. To me, it didn't feel like a coordinated national offensive at first. It just felt like our local reality had been dialed up to an unbearable intensity. We were no longer being hit occasionally at night. We were being bombarded day and night. We were preparing to move north to support the Marines who were taking the brunt of the fighting around the DMZ. In mid-February, my unit moved to a temporary base at Phu Bai, a Marine installation. The place was under constant mortar and rocket attack. We lived in tents, one for officers, one for flight crew, one for ground crew, and had a one-seater latrine and a one-barrel shower. The rain was incessant, turning the entire base into a sea of mud. I remember visiting the Marine Hospital there after a particularly heavy attack. The building was in shambles. Our Chinooks were needed because the Marines' own helicopters, the C-46C Knights, couldn't carry as much. We were flying nonstop, supporting both the Marines and Army troops, hauling men and supplies into the fight. One day, we had to deliver a package to a supply ship in the South China Sea. Landing on that ship was like visiting another planet. The sailors were clean, their uniforms crisp. We were covered in mud up to our knees, stinking from weeks in the field. They were fascinated by us, asking about the war, looking at our M60s and M16s. They invited us for lunch, and it was the first warm, properly cooked meal I'd had in a long time. They took pictures with us before we flew back to the mud and the chaos. The fighting intensified as we moved closer to the DMZ. Near a place called Dongha, we took a lot of hits. This led to my second crash. One of our engines started failing. The pilot told me to look out the porthole. I saw that the pylon holding the aft transmission and engine was literally falling apart. Pieces of sheet metal were tearing off and flying away. One piece had fallen into the air intake of the engine. We landed immediately, right there in the middle of nowhere. We had already dropped our troops, so it was just us, the air crew. We knew we couldn't fly it any further. A pylon failure would be catastrophic. Some troopers from another division, maybe the 9th or 4th Infantry, formed a perimeter around us. A maintenance helicopter came in, and they riveted 2 big metal bars in an X shape across the damaged pylon to hold it together. My crew chief flew out with the maintenance crew. I stayed with the aircraft, and with just one pilot, we flew our crippled Chinook back to Pubai. It was a tense flight, but the pylon held. Soon after, we began the process of establishing a new, more permanent base camp for the 1st Cavalry, Camp Evans. The Tet Offensive was still raging, and our primary mission was to support the battle for Hue. We were a crucial part of the effort to block North Vietnamese regulars from reinforcing their troops inside the city. I remember flying missions to insert elements of the 5th of the 7th Cavalry, the famed Gary Owen Regiment. We'd fly in low under the perpetual gray clouds and rain to land our troopers on the outskirts of the city. We could see the citadel, the ancient fortress at the heart of Hue, in the distance. Every time we went in, we took hits. The weather was so bad that we had to fly just above the treetops, sometimes as low as 200 feet, making us easy targets. But we flew anyway. We had to. The troopers on the ground were depending on us for reinforcements and resupply. I remember them handing me their letters to mail, their faces grim as we dropped them into the meat grinder. In early March, with only about 20 days left on my tour, came the 3rd and final crash. I was no longer the primary flight engineer on my aircraft. I was training my crew chief to take my place. So for that mission, I was flying in the crew chief's position, manning the gun. We had just dropped off some Marines and taken on a load of their wounded and dead. As soon as we lifted off, the world exploded. We took at least 50 rounds in a few seconds. The hydraulic systems were shredded. Red fluid filled the cabin, and the rotor blades began their terrifying whistle. We went down, hard. Another Chinook landed nearby, and we scrambled aboard, leaving our wrecked aircraft behind. It was in the chaos of that crash that the young gunner behind me was hit. He died the next day. The raw, selfish thought that had pierced through my fear as we fell, the thought of my own survival, of my 20 days, haunted me. The nearness of my own departure made the loss of his future all the more stark. The final days of my tour were spent at Camp Evans, under the same constant threat. During one last attack, the enemy penetrated the wire at night again, and they blew up our water trucks. For 2 days, we had to survive on only the water in our canteens until a new convoy could get through. It was a fittingly grim end to a long and brutal year. When the day finally came to leave, they offered me a deal. If I extended my tour by 6 months, I'd hit my 2-year mark and they would give me a promotion to Specialist 6. I was tempted, but after being knocked out of the sky 3 times in 3 months, I felt like my luck was running out. I turned them down. I told them I was grateful, but I was going home as an E5. Leaving Vietnam was a profound experience. I was glad to have gone, to have done my duty. I had gone from an E3 to an E5 in 9 months, and I had seen and done things I hoped never to experience again. But I had also learned things about myself. I had grown up Catholic, but my faith had been lukewarm, a matter of habit. In the back of a shaking helicopter, with bullets tearing through the thin aluminum skin, prayer became real. It wasn't a foxhole, but it was the same principle. I learned to pray not just out of habit, but out of a desperate, honest need. I prayed to God as a friend and a savior. I also learned to accept the fragility of life. In Vietnam, I saw young men, my age, with their bodies broken. Life wasn't a guarantee of growing old. It could be snatched away in an instant. I learned to accept both life and death, and in doing so, I found a deeper faith and a clearer sense of what I wanted to do with my own life. I took my 30-day leave at home in San Antonio. Hemisphere, the World's Fair, had just opened, and I got to see it. Then I reported to my new duty station at Fort Benning, Georgia. The Army sent word that they had lowered the eyesight standards for the Warrant Officer Candidate Program. I could become a pilot after all, but by then I was an NCO, and I liked it. I liked the small privileges, like not having to wait in the mess hall line. I decided against becoming an Army pilot. Instead, I joined the base's flight club and earned my civilian pilot's license. I also joined the ride and hunt club and finally learned to ride a horse, something everyone assumed a kid from Texas already knew how to do. I served out the rest of my time, leaving the Army in June of 1969. I went home and, using the GI Bill, enrolled in Our Lady of the Lake College, which had just started accepting men. I poured all my energy into my studies, getting my bachelor's degree in sociology in 3 years. I went on to get my master's in social work, also on the GI Bill, and spent the next 27.5 years working at the San Antonio State Hospital. I got married, had 4 children, and watched them grow up and succeed. I built a life, but that year in the highlands and deltas of Vietnam, in the vibrating heart of a Chinook, is a part of me that will never fade. It was a year of fire and mud, of profound loss and unexpected grace, the year that forged the man I would become.